Hi, my name is Patrick McGrady and I teach film and television at the University of East Anglia. When I'm not teaching, I also work as a producer and director of documentaries for film and television. I started out as a freelancer working for different production companies and broadcasters, and then more recently I actually set up my own production company, a company called Wavelength Films, and we specialise in documentaries, factual programmes for broadcasters like the BBC, Sky, ITV, and the History Channel. And we've also recently started to branch out into drama as well. Today, I want to talk about some aspects of editing for film and television. That's the stage of the production process where you take all the different pieces of the jigsaw that you've captured in your shoot on location and you try to put them together to make the final story that you want to share with an audience. If things have gone well, that's the stage where the story all comes together. If you haven't done so well on location, it could be the stage where things start to fall apart a bit. I certainly think that most filmmakers I know would argue that editing is perhaps the most important stage of the whole process. It's the point where films are actually made. You could think of it a bit like this, I suppose. If you are out on a shoot, you are shopping for your ingredients, you're trying to gather them all together into your basket, taking them home, and then when you get to the edit, that's where you cook it all up. You try to create that delicious, appetizing, appealing meal for your audience. In this introductory talk, we're going to be looking briefly at some historical aspects of the subject and discovering how many of the principles of editing that are still incredibly widely used today were first experimented with almost 100 years ago, especially by a group of Russian filmmakers and theorists about film. And we're also going to think about the different stages that a documentary project might go through during the edit. So these days, the editing process usually looks something like this. All that footage that you've captured on location is brought into what's called an edit suite, and it's loaded onto a computer system. And then the editor will start to work on that material. To help them, they use software packages that give them all sorts of creative tools, ways of manipulating that footage to turn it into a story. The most widely used examples of that software in the industry are programs such as Avid or Premiere Pro or the Apple system Final Cut Pro. Now, if you've used anything like iMovie or Windows Media Editor, the sorts of programs that are quite widely available and often preloaded on computers or laptops that you might use, you'll get the principles, and the principles of something like Avid aren't widely different. They're perhaps a bit more sophisticated in what they allow you to do, but the basic premise is the same. It's a software package that allows you to play around with that footage. So these days, editing is what we call a digital process, but when film first began, of course, that wasn't the case at all. Then it was very much a physical activity. The film was strips of celluloid that the editor actually manipulated by hand. They chopped it up using scissors and they glued it back together to assemble the sequences and chapters of their story. That's why we call it cutting a film, because it was a physical process. The principles aren't radically different. The software that we talked about, Avid, Final Cut, Premiere Pro, essentially gives you digital tools to do what back in the day editors used scissors and glue for. So these days, I think we pretty much take it for granted that films are edited together. We tell our stories as a result of putting together a whole range of individual shots to create our overall effect. But if you go back to the early days of film, it wasn't quite such an obvious thing. In fact, at that point, many early filmmakers were simply interested in sharing single images or single shots with audiences. They would go somewhere beautiful to capture a landscape or some piece of action, and they weren't really bothered about putting that together in terms of lots of different individual shots. They simply wanted to share and celebrate that beauty, if you like, that new beauty of the moving image, the thing that moved us on from still photography into a whole new world. So at that point, editing maybe wasn't at the forefront of people's minds. But then in the 1910s and 1920s, some filmmakers began to get excited by the possibilities that opened up when you started to think about placing shots in a sequence, putting one shot next to another, next to another. And in particular, there was excitement in Russia about this. There were a whole group of filmmakers working together, feeding off each other, arguing sometimes with each other, debating the possibilities of this new art form. One of the first and earliest people to think about this was a filmmaker called Lev Kuleshov, and he became famous for what is now known as the Kuleshov effect. He took a shot like this, a shot of a man with apparently quite a blank expression on his face. In isolation, on its own, what does that shot mean? It's difficult to interpret. What is that man thinking? What is he feeling? Who knows? Then Kuleshov started to explore what happened if you placed another shot next to that shot. So first of all, he placed this shot next to it. And then, if we play those shots in sequence, as an audience, we start to bring our own ideas and interpretation to what that man might be thinking. And we, as an audience, assume that what the man is thinking is, I'm hungry, or I'd love to eat that, or doesn't that look delicious? In other words, we bring meaning by seeing those two shots placed in connection with each other. So far, so good. However, the next thing that Kuleshov did was say, what happens if I take exactly the same image of the man with exactly the same expression? In fact, it's the same shot. I haven't even filmed it again. It's exactly the same shot, but place it in connection with another image, a very different image, this time a rather sad image of a child lying in a coffin. And now, as an audience, perhaps we start to interpret that man's face rather differently. Whereas before he was looking excited, dreaming of this delicious meal he was about to eat, now we read different things into that expression. We start to think this is a man perhaps experiencing great sadness or grief, loss. The same image, but us as an audience taking a very different meaning from it. The third and final juxtaposition of images that Kuleshov explored in this little experiment, if you like, was this one, a woman reclining on a couch. And again, now Kuleshov suggests, as an audience, we take another meaning from that man's expression. It's not the hunger of the man looking at the meal. It's not the sadness of the man thinking about that poor child lying in the coffin. Now it's a man experiencing lust or attraction. And Kuleshov was just one of several filmmakers in Russia at the time who were excited by the possibilities of this new medium. Another very famous filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, was also very excited by the possibilities of editing, or what he termed montage. And he started to think about the different types of montage, the different types of edited sequence that you might use in a film. In fact, he identified what he thought were 5 different categories of montage: metric, rhythmic, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual. Each of those 5 different modes of montage, types of montage, could generate a different effect, would have a different impact on the viewer. Some of them might be about creating suspense or drama or tension or excitement. Others might be designed to promote particular ideas or thoughts in the mind of the audience. Others might be about creating atmosphere or mood. But essentially what he was thinking about, therefore, was the power that editing has to shape the way an audience reads a story. And that remains true today as it did 100 years ago when Eisenstein was exploring these ideas. So as I mentioned, my primary experience as a filmmaker is as a maker of documentary programs, as a director and a producer of factual films. And I wanted to talk a little bit now about the stages that you go through in the edit to put together a documentary. And I think you can think about the editing process as breaking down into 2 main stages. The first and earliest stage is what's sometimes called the offline stage of an edit. And this is really the point of the process where your focus is on shaping your story, in carving from the potentially hours or maybe tens or hundreds of hours of material that you've filmed on location, carving out of that the 30 minutes or 60 minutes that you want to put out into the world in the form of your final film. So we start with the offline, and the offline itself can also then be broken down into smaller stages. So the first stage we want to think about is what's sometimes called logging your rushes. What does logging your rushes mean? Essentially, it means taking stock of what has been filmed on location, watching it, thinking about it, and sorting and organising it so that you have a clear sense of which bits of that material might be useful to you and which bits, frankly, can be thrown in the bin because they didn't work, because the camera was out of focus or something else went wrong that makes that material unusable. Once you've done that, you can start the next stage of the offline process, which is doing your assembly. And at this point, what you're trying to do is start to string together the different building blocks of your film in quite a loose, rough way. And what we're trying to do at this point is get a general sense of whether the story that we want to tell is coming through in the footage that we've shot. We don't worry too much about making it perfect. We don't worry if we have the occasional jump cut. We don't worry if sometimes the shots are a bit longer than they need to be, or things are a bit loose and baggy. What we're looking for is just that overall shape of the story. Is it coming through? So, for example, at this point of the process, maybe your target is to make a film that's 30 minutes long. You might do an assembly which runs for 40 minutes, possibly even 45. So it's going to have to cut down and become much tighter and much better defined. But you do that assembly just to get a sense of the overall shape of your story. Once you've done that and you feel confident that it's working, you can start to then pick apart individual sequences, as we call them, of that story and work on them in a more detailed way. This is where you do your rough cut. At the rough cut stage, we might start to share our film with other people. Again, if you're working for a broadcaster like the BBC, they'll have given you money to make this. So they're quite keen to find out if you're delivering what they want. So quite often someone from the broadcaster would come and sit in for a few hours of the edit just to see how the programme is shaping up, to give advice, to give their feedback, to give their ideas about what you might do to that show. This is still what we call the offline edit. So this is the point where we're still thinking about our story. As we finish the rough cut, we then pretty confident that the client likes the show, we hope. And therefore we can start to get it even closer to our running time. This is where we start to work on what we call the fine cut. At this point, we're making those last minute decisions about the story. Do we need a close-up at this point in the show? Do we want to hold that shot for a bit longer? Are we going to add some music to create a different mood or feel for this part of the film? In other words, we're fine-tuning the story to the point where we ultimately want to get it to exactly the right running length. And once we've done that, and this client is happy and has signed it off, we've done all the stages of the offline edit. We've completed our fine cut of the film, and it runs at exactly the right length. And hopefully, as the filmmakers, we're happy with the story that we've told. Once we've done that, that's not the end of the job. That's the end of the offline edit. And the next stage of the process is where we then polish that show to get it to the highest level of technical quality so that, again, it's ready to go out there into the world and be shown to audiences. And that is what we call the online edit. When you move into the online, story is going to be important, but actually your main focus at this stage of the edit is on the technical and aesthetic qualities of your film. So, for example, one of the things you would focus on in the online edit is the picture quality itself. When you're on location, you do everything you can, of course, to create fantastic images, and hopefully you work with very experienced camera operators and sound recordists to capture really good raw materials. But sometimes things go wrong. So, for example, you might be in a location where you have underexposed your shots. In other words, they're not quite bright enough. In the online, you can try and fix that. You can use software programs to enhance the exposure and bring it to the right level. Similarly, if you've overexposed and the image is a bit washed out, burnt out, there are certain things you can do to try and improve that in the online. Another thing you can do, and sometimes there's a specialist person who would deal with this for you, is what's called grading your pictures. Again, this is where you pull out or draw out the maximum color and think about the tone or mood that you're trying to create in your film and how colour and image quality can enhance that. So the colorist, or the grader as they're sometimes called, are very important parts of your team. They can wring the last drops of value out of the footage that you've shot. So here's an example of an ungraded shot. This is the raw material that was captured on location. And here's what it might look like once it's been graded. The other thing that happens at this stage of the edit is someone will start to think about your sound, because sound is an incredibly important part of filmmaking. In many cases, as audiences, we can be quite forgiving sometimes of the picture quality. If a story is really good and compelling and drawing us in and engaging us, we forgive the fact that occasionally the shot is slightly out of focus, or something's not perfect about it, the camera wobbles or something. If the sound is poor, if the sound peaks too much so it distorts, or we can't hear what people are saying, then I think we're much less forgiving and it breaks us out of the moment. So sound is very important, and editing sound is a part of the editing process too. Now, in the online stage of the process, you would usually have a specialist sound editor working on the sound of your film. In other words, making sure that the different elements of sound that you brought together, the sound captured on location, maybe music, maybe voiceover or commentary, someone telling us the story, that these different layers of sound are nicely mixed and blended together to be effective, to be audible, to be at the right levels so that the film communicates very clearly to us. So there we have the different stages of editing for a documentary film. We start with the offline, we log our material, we assemble it, we do a rough cut, and then we do a fine cut. And once that fine cut has been signed off, we move towards the online. And there we work to grade our pictures, we add captions if necessary, and we do a sound mix. And once that's been completed, your film is ready for the audience. So in the class that follows this introduction, I want to dig down into some more detail around the editor's role in storytelling, and in particular I'm going to be focusing on the editor's role in documentary storytelling. I'm going to use some examples of scenes or sequences from films that I've actually worked on, and we'll explore the way those scenes were shot and then the way that they were played around within the edit. And I'm going to ask you, in fact, to help me make some choices about how we might assemble some of that material to create an effective sequence. Before the session, it would be a really good idea for you to watch some films or other types of video content, and in particular focus on the way that those pieces of work have been edited, to think really hard about the styles of editing that are used in those pieces of film. And again, I'm thinking here you could look at drama films, you could look at documentaries, or you could look at something like music video, because each of them will have their own unique editing style. And I'd like you to think about the way those styles are used in that type of work. What's the editor done, and what impact does it have on you as a viewer? You could also look out for examples of editing which are more experimental, where the continuity is broken, perhaps because they use something like the jump cut to break us out of the moment and foreground the act of editing itself. And ask yourself, which of those styles has the most impact on you? Which do you prefer? And why do you think the filmmakers have chosen to use that style of editing in that particular piece of work?